The man who lived 5 lives. First life. I opened my eyes for the first time in a cold, dark room. The air smelled damp, and the sound of wind whistling through cracks in the walls filled my ears. I was born in a small village surrounded by mountains. Life here was harsh and unforgiving, like the icy wind that seemed to find its way into every corner of our tiny home. Our house was no more than a fragile shelter. The walls were made of mud mixed with straw, and the roof was a patchwork of old wooden planks and dry grass. When it rained, water dripped inside, forming puddles on the dirt floor. My bed was a thin straw mat, rough and uncomfortable, but it was all we had. My family was large. I had 2 older brothers, a younger sister, and my parents. My father worked in the fields from dawn until nightfall, trying to grow enough food to keep us alive. My mother stayed home, cooking and caring for us, though there was little to cook. The world outside our village was terrifying. War was everywhere, like a storm that never ended. I was too young to understand why people were fighting, but I heard the grown-ups whispering about soldiers, battles, and death. At night, the sky lit up with flashes of gunfire, and the distant booms of bombs made me tremble under my thin blanket. Hunger was my constant companion. There was never enough food to go around. My mother tried her best to make meals out of almost nothing. She boiled water with a few leaves or scraps of vegetables, calling it soup. My little sister cried often because she was hungry, but there was nothing more to give her. One day our lives changed forever. It started with the sound of heavy boots marching into our village. Soldiers arrived, shouting orders and pointing their guns at us. They searched every house, looking for food, money, or anything valuable. When they came to our home, my mother begged them to leave us something, just a little grain for her children. But the soldiers only laughed. They took everything: our goat, our last sack of flour, and even the pot my mother used to cook. After the soldiers left, my family sat in silence. My mother held my crying sister, her face pale with fear and sorrow. My father stared at the empty corner where our goat used to be, his hands clenched into fists. That night we had nothing to eat. The war didn't just steal our food, it also stole my father. One morning, he left to join the fight, saying he had to protect us. He kissed my mother goodbye and told my brothers to take care of the family. But he never came back. Weeks turned into months, and we heard no news of him. My older brothers did their best to help. They worked in the fields and tried to catch fish in the river, but it was never enough. My mother grew thinner each day, her once strong hands now weak and trembling. I wanted to help too, but I was just a boy. The winter that year was the coldest I could remember. Snow covered the ground, and the wind howled through the cracks in our home. We huddled together for warmth, but the cold seemed to seep into our bones. One night, as the wind roared outside and my stomach ached with hunger, I felt my body growing weaker. My mother held me close, her tears falling onto my face. "Stay with me," she whispered, but I couldn't. My eyes closed, and the cold faded away. My first life ended in darkness, hunger, and the quiet sorrow of a mother's love. Second life. When I opened my eyes for the second time, everything was different. Instead of darkness and cold, I was surrounded by warmth and golden light. The ceiling above me was high, painted with colorful patterns that sparkled in the sunlight. My crib was soft, made of fine wood and lined with silky fabric. I could smell the sweet scent of flowers, and the sound of birds singing came through the open windows. I had been born into wealth. My family lived in a grand mansion with walls of polished stone and windows so clean they shone like mirrors. The floors were covered with soft rugs, and every room was filled with beautiful furniture, paintings, and golden decorations. My parents were important people. My father was a powerful businessman, and my mother was known for her beauty and elegance. As I grew older, I realized that I could have anything I wanted. Servants brought me food, toys, and clothes before I even asked. If I wanted a new toy, someone bought it. If I wanted to ride a horse, someone prepared it for me. I never had to wait or work for anything. At first, I thought this life was perfect. I never felt hungry, cold, or afraid. My clothes were made from the finest materials, and every meal was a feast. There were plates of roasted meat, baskets of fresh fruit, and desserts so sweet they melted in my mouth. But as I grew older, I began to feel something I couldn't understand. Despite all the luxury around me, I often felt empty. My days were filled with comfort, but my heart felt hollow. One day I asked my mother, "Why are we so rich?" She smiled and stroked my hair. "Because your father works very hard, my dear. This is our reward for his success." But her answer didn't satisfy me. I wanted to understand more. I watched the people who worked for us, the servants, the gardeners, the cooks. They worked from morning until night, always busy, always tired. Yet they often smiled and laughed with each other. They seemed happier than I was. As I grew into a teenager, my loneliness deepened. I went to a private school where all the students came from wealthy families. Everyone wore expensive clothes and talked about their vacations, their cars, and their parties. But their laughter seemed fake, their smiles empty. One evening, at a grand party my parents hosted, I saw a girl my age standing by the window. She was beautiful, with bright eyes and a kind smile. I felt drawn to her, and for the first time, my heart felt alive. I gathered my courage and walked over to her. We talked for hours. Her name was Amelia, and she wasn't like the other guests. She loved books and art, and she dreamed of traveling the world. I felt a connection with her that I had never felt with anyone else. But as the party ended, I overheard two women whispering nearby. "Did you see how that girl was talking to him? She's probably after his money." Their words hit me like a cold wind. I began to wonder, did Amelia really like me, or was she only interested in my wealth? Doubt crept into my mind, and I pulled away from her. This became a pattern in my life. Every time someone tried to get close to me, I questioned their intentions. Did they care about me, or were they attracted to my money and status? The doubt poisoned my relationships, and I began to feel trapped by my wealth. Years passed, and my loneliness grew. I traveled to beautiful places, stayed in luxurious hotels, and attended grand events, but nothing filled the emptiness inside me. I longed for something real, something that couldn't be bought with money. One rainy afternoon, I stood on the balcony of my mansion, looking out at the gardens. The rain fell gently, washing over the flowers and trees. I thought about my life and realized the truth. I had everything, yet I had nothing. That evening, as I sat alone in the grand dining hall, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. The room spun and my vision blurred. The next moment, everything went dark. My second life ended not with struggle, but with the silent weight of emptiness. Third life. When I opened my eyes for the third time, the world around me felt warm and full of love. I was born in a small but cheerful home. The walls were painted in soft colors, and sunlight poured through the windows, making the little house feel alive. The sound of birds singing outside mixed with the soft laughter of my parents. My parents were not rich, but they were not poor either. They lived a simple life, filled with hard work and hope. My father worked as a teacher in a local school, and my mother sewed clothes to sell in the market. They had fallen in love as young students and built their life together with dreams of a better future. From a young age, I noticed how deeply my parents cared for each other and for me. Every morning, my father would kiss my mother on the forehead before leaving for work. My mother would hum cheerful tunes as she prepared breakfast, often sharing funny stories about her customers at the market. Life was simple but good. We didn't have much, but we always had enough. Dinner was usually a bowl of lentil soup and fresh bread, and on special occasions, my mother would bake a small cake. Despite our modest lifestyle, there was always laughter and warmth in our home. However, outside our little house, the world was not so kind. Our country was full of unrest. People were unhappy because they felt life was unfair. They talked about justice, freedom, and change. Every evening, my father would sit in his chair, reading the newspaper with a troubled look on his face. As I grew older, I began to understand the struggles of the world around us. My parents worked hard, but they often spoke in whispers about the difficulties they faced. Taxes were high, and opportunities were few. My father's salary was barely enough to cover our needs, and my mother often stayed up late, sewing by the dim light of a lantern. One day, while walking home from school, I saw a group of people gathered in the town square. They were shouting, holding signs, and demanding change. The air was thick with tension, and soldiers stood nearby, their faces stern and their weapons ready. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. At dinner that night, I asked my father about it. He sighed deeply and put down his fork. "People are tired, my son," he said. "They want a better life, but it's not easy to bring change. Sometimes, trying to change things can bring more pain." Despite his warnings, my father couldn't stay silent. He began attending meetings with others who wanted to fight for justice. My mother worried about him, but he always said, "I have to do this for you, for our family, for the future." One evening, my father came home late, his clothes dusty and his face tired. He hugged my mother tightly and said, "The police came to our meeting today. They arrested some of my friends." Fear filled my mother's eyes, but she said nothing. The following weeks were filled with tension. My father tried to hide his worry, but I could see it in his eyes. One night, soldiers came to our house. They knocked loudly, and when my father opened the door, they took him away. My mother begged them to let him stay, but they didn't listen. For weeks we heard nothing about my father. My mother cried silently at night, thinking I couldn't hear her. When news finally came, it was heartbreaking. My father had been sent far away, to a prison where political prisoners were kept. Life became harder after that. My mother worked even more, sewing clothes late into the night to support us. I tried to help by running errands and doing small jobs, but it was never enough. One day, while playing outside, I saw a group of children laughing and playing a game. For a moment, I forgot all my worries and joined them. But as the sun set, I returned home to the sight of my mother sitting alone by the window, her sewing untouched. Her face looked older, and her shoulders sagged under the weight of our troubles. Despite everything, my mother remained strong. She often told me stories about my father, reminding me of his courage and love for justice. She said, "No matter what happens, we must keep hope alive." But hope was hard to hold on to. As the political unrest grew, so did our struggles. One night, as I sat by the window looking at the stars, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I fell to the floor, and my vision blurred. My mother's voice called out to me, but it grew fainter and fainter. My third life ended in a world where love was strong, but the weight of injustice and hardship was stronger. Fourth life. When I opened my eyes for the fourth time, I saw endless whiteness all around me. The world was cold and quiet, unlike anything I had ever known. I was born in a small wooden cabin, surrounded by snow that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the distant calls of birds. This time I was born in isolation. My parents lived on a tiny island near the Arctic, far from cities, people, and the noise of the world. They had chosen this life of solitude, away from politics, war, and the complications of society. Our cabin was small but sturdy, built to protect us from the icy winds. Inside, a fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with warmth. Thick blankets and furs covered every surface, and shelves lined with jars of food filled the corners. He spent his days catching fish from the icy waters and gathering firewood. My mother tended to the cabin, cooked meals, and told me stories about the world beyond the island, a world I could only imagine. As I grew, I began to explore our island. It was beautiful in its emptiness. The snow sparkled like diamonds under the sunlight, and the frozen sea shimmered like glass. I would spend hours walking along the shore, watching seals sunbathe on the ice or listening to the distant cries of whales. But the beauty of the island couldn't hide its loneliness. There were no other children to play with, no neighbors to visit, no bustling towns or markets. My only companions were my parents and the animals that lived on the island. Life here was simple but hard. Every day was a battle against nature. My father taught me how to fish through holes in the ice, how to track animals in the snow, and how to read the stars to find my way. My mother showed me how to make clothes from animal skins and how to preserve food for the long winters. The winters were the hardest. The sun disappeared for months, leaving us in darkness. The cold was so fierce that even stepping outside for a few minutes was dangerous. During these times, we huddled by the fire, telling stories to pass the long, dark night. My parents often spoke of the world they had left behind. Why did you leave? I asked one evening, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. My father sighed, staring into the fire. The world is full of chaos, my son. People fight over land, power, and money. We wanted a life of peace, away from all that. My mother nodded. But peace comes at a cost. Here we are safe from the troubles of the world, but we are also far from its joys. As I grew older, I began to understand what they meant. The peace of our island was comforting, but it was also isolating. I often dreamed of what lay beyond the icy horizon. I imagined cities full of people, music, and laughter. I wondered what it would be like to have friends, to fall in love, to see the world my parents had left behind. One day, while exploring the island, I found an old wooden boat washed up on the shore. Its surface was cracked, and its sails were torn, but it sparked something inside me, a longing for adventure. I spent weeks repairing the boat, using whatever materials I could find. "Why are you doing this?" my father asked, his voice heavy with worry. "I want to see the world," I said. "I want to know what's out there." He shook his head. "The world is not as kind as you think, my son. There is beauty, yes, but also pain." Despite his warning, I couldn't let go of my dream. The day I finished the boat, I stood on the shore, ready to leave. My mother hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered, "and never forget where you came from." As I sailed away, the island grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the horizon. For the first time in my life, I felt free. But freedom was not what I imagined. The sea was vast and merciless. Waves crashed against my boat, and the cold wind bit at my skin. Days turned into weeks, and I began to regret leaving the safety of my island. One stormy night, as lightning lit up the sky, a massive wave struck my boat. I was thrown into the icy water, and everything went dark. My fourth life ended in the same cold emptiness where it had begun. I had sought adventure and connection, but in the end, I found only the relentless power of nature. Fifth life. When I opened my eyes for the fifth time, I felt a sense of calmness I had never experienced before. I was born into a world that seemed to have found a delicate balance. My family was neither rich nor poor, and the place we lived in was safe, warm, and full of opportunities. This time, I was born into a life of learning, curiosity, and reflection. My parents were kind and thoughtful people. My father was a professor of philosophy, always surrounded by books and deep in thought. My mother was a scientist who loved exploring the mysteries of the natural world. From a young age, they encouraged me to ask questions, think deeply, and never stop learning. Our home was filled with books, papers, and tools for experiment. My father's study smelled of old leather and ink, while my mother's workspace was alive with the scent of herbs, chemicals, and earth. They often talked about their work during dinner, their conversations weaving together ideas about the universe, human nature, and the beauty of discovery. As I grew older, I became fascinated by the questions they asked. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? How does the world work? These questions became the center of my life, and I devoted myself to finding answers. In school, I excelled in every subject, not because I wanted to be the best, but because I was deeply curious. I spent hours in the library, reading everything I could about philosophy, science, and history. My teachers often said I was wise beyond my years, and my classmates called me the thinker. By the time I reached adulthood, I had become a philosopher and scientist, much like my parents. My work was respected, and people from around the world came to hear my lectures or read my writings. I explored the mysteries of the universe, from the tiniest particles to the vastness of space. I debated with other great minds and shared my ideas in books and journals. Yet, despite all my achievements, a strange emptiness lingered inside me. I had answers to so many questions, but one remained unanswered. What is the true purpose of life? One night, while sitting alone in my study, surrounded by books and notes, I stared out the window at the stars. They seemed so far away, so unreachable, and I realized that no matter how much I learned, there were some mysteries I might never solve. As the years passed, I continued my work, but the emptiness grew. I began to wonder if the purpose of life was not in the answers I sought but in the experiences I lived. I had spent so much time thinking and studying that I had forgotten to truly live. One day, an old friend visited me. She was someone I had known in my youth, a lively, cheerful woman who had always seen the world differently from me. She had traveled the world, met countless people, and lived a life full of love, adventure, and joy. "You've achieved so much," she said, looking around my study. "But are you happy?" Her question startled me. No one had ever asked me that before. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent my life searching for meaning, but I feel like something is missing." She smiled gently. "Maybe meaning isn't something you find in books or theories. Maybe it's something you create through the connections you make and the moments you cherish." Her words stayed with me. I began to look at my life differently. I started spending more time with friends and family, sharing meals, laughter, and stories. I traveled to places I had only read about, experiencing their beauty with my own eyes. I even fell in love, a love that wasn't perfect but was deeply human and real. As I neared the end of my life, I realized that every life I had lived before had taught me something important. The first life taught me the value of resilience. The second life showed me that wealth cannot buy happiness. The third life reminded me of the importance of justice and love. The fourth life revealed the beauty and challenge of solitude. And this fifth life taught me that the purpose of life is not just to seek answers but to live fully, love deeply, and embrace the mysteries we may never solve. On my final night, I sat by the window, looking at the stars once more. This time, they didn't feel so far away. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace. And then I let go. In the end, I realized that life is not about what we know but about how we live. Each life, each moment is a gift, and its meaning is something we create with every choice we make.